Jessamine County, Kentucky. November 1847. When Kentucky state marshals arrived at Millbrook Inn, following reports of suspicious deaths among travelers, they expected to find evidence of disease, perhaps typhoid or cholera, the common killers of the frontier era. The inn's proprietresses, the Cunningham sisters, had reported 3 guest deaths in as many weeks, all attributed to sudden illness. In 1847 Kentucky, such deaths were unfortunate but not unusual. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and epidemic disease made travel dangerous, even in the best establishments. What the marshals discovered instead made the senior investigator order the property sealed and a complete excavation of the grounds. In the orchard behind the inn, beneath rows of carefully tended apple trees, they found 43 graves. 43 bodies in various states of decomposition, buried in shallow plots, marked only by stones the sisters had claimed were for drainage purposes. 43 travelers who had checked into Millbrook Inn seeking a night's rest, and never checked out. 43 murders, spanning nearly a decade, committed by 2 women who had offered hospitality, affection, and poison to lonely men traveling Kentucky's wilderness roads. But it was what the marshals found inside the inn itself that revealed the true nature of the Cunningham sisters' operation. A ledger, hidden beneath floorboards in the kitchen, written in 2 distinct hands, documenting not just murders, but a carefully calculated system of seduction, robbery, and disposal. Each entry included the victim's name, when known, a description, when not, the date of death, the method used, and most disturbingly, a rating of how much the victim had been worth in both money and what the sisters called entertainment value. The ledger's first entry was dated March 1838. The final entry was dated October 1847, written just 3 weeks before the marshals arrived, and it was signed by both sisters. Catherine Cunningham, age 34, the elder sister who managed the business operations, and Sarah Cunningham, age 29, the younger sister who specialized in what the ledger called guest relations. 2 women who had transformed a legitimate frontier inn into a killing ground, operating beneath the facade of hospitality and feminine virtue for nearly 10 years. Before we continue with the story of the Cunningham sisters and the orchard of death behind Millbrook Inn, we need you to join this investigation. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, where evil wore the mask of kindness and operated in the isolation of the frontier, deserve to be told. Leave a comment telling us what you think. We want to know if you believe 2 women could commit 43 murders without anyone suspecting the truth for nearly a decade. What happened at Millbrook Inn didn't begin with murder. It began with desperation and a business opportunity that existed in the lawless space between civilization and wilderness. Jessamine County, Kentucky in 1837 was frontier territory. Despite being less than 50 miles from Lexington, the region was developing rapidly, with new roads connecting isolated settlements and encouraging travel for trade and migration westward. But infrastructure lagged behind ambition. The roads were dangerous. Travelers needed places to stop, rest, and resupply. Inns and taverns were scarce, making the few establishments that existed both profitable and essential to frontier commerce. Into this opportunity came the Cunningham sisters in the spring of 1837. Catherine and Sarah arrived in Jessamine County with enough money to purchase a large farmhouse along the Lexington-Danville Road, though the source of this money was never quite explained. They claimed to be widows, though no records of their marriages or their husbands' deaths have ever been found. They claimed to have family back east who'd provided inheritance, though no such family was ever documented. They were women with carefully constructed backgrounds that didn't withstand scrutiny. But in 1837 frontier Kentucky, no one scrutinized too carefully. Catherine was 30 years old when they arrived, a tall woman with dark hair and a commanding presence that made people assume she was older and more experienced than her years. She had a mind for numbers, for business, for the practical details of running an establishment. She spoke with authority and handled money with confidence that suggested she'd done so before, though where and when remained mysterious. Sarah was 25, pretty in a way that frontier settlements rarely saw, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and a manner that combined innocence with something else. Something that made men uncomfortable and interested in equal measure. She was charming, could make conversation with anyone, and had a talent for making lonely travelers feel special, seen, and desired. The sisters renovated their farmhouse extensively, creating 6 guest rooms upstairs, a large common room for dining, and living quarters for themselves on the first floor. They hired a cook, an elderly woman named Martha, who lived in a small cabin on the property. They planted an orchard of apple trees, ostensibly for cider and pies to serve guests. They advertised in Lexington newspapers. Millbrook Inn, fine lodging for travelers, Christian hospitality, reasonable rates. Proprietresses C&S Cunningham. The inn opened in July 1837 and attracted business immediately. The location was perfect, positioned at a day's journey from both Lexington and Danville, making it an ideal stopping point for travelers moving between the cities or continuing westward. The accommodations were clean, the food was good, and the Cunningham sisters were attentive hosts who made guests feel welcome in ways that other frontier establishments, often dirty and inhospitable, did not. What made Millbrook Inn particularly popular among male travelers was Sarah. She had a way of making men feel interesting. She would sit with solo travelers in the common room after dinner, listening to their stories, laughing at their jokes, touching their arms in ways that seemed innocent, but suggested possibilities. She never did anything overtly inappropriate. The sisters maintained reputations as respectable Christian women. But Sarah's attention made lonely men feel desired, and many travelers would specifically request rooms at Millbrook Inn on return trips, hoping for another evening of Sarah's company. For the first year, Millbrook Inn operated legitimately. The sisters made modest profits from room fees and meal charges. They developed a reputation for quality service. Travelers would recommend the establishment to others. Everything appeared normal, successful even, for a frontier business. But in March 1838, something changed. A traveler named William Morrison stayed at the inn. He was a merchant, traveling from Lexington to Nashville, with approximately $500 in cash from recent sales. He spent the evening talking with Sarah in the common room, drinking the sisters' apple cider, clearly enchanted by the attention she gave him. He retired to his room around 10 in the evening, apparently in good health and spirits. The next morning, he didn't come down for breakfast. Catherine went to check on him and found him dead in his bed. She called for the local doctor, who examined the body and pronounced Morrison dead of heart failure, which seemed plausible for a man in his 50s who'd been drinking and eating heavily the night before. Morrison was buried in the inn's orchard, the sisters explaining that transporting his body back to Lexington was impractical, and they wanted to give him a proper Christian burial on their property. Morrison's money was never found. His horse and belongings disappeared. When his family inquired about his possessions weeks later, the sisters claimed he'd carried very little with him, certainly no large sum of money, and that what few items he'd had were buried with him, as was proper. What the ledger discovered 9 years later revealed was that William Morrison had been the Cunningham sisters' first murder. Sarah had laced his evening cider with a tincture made from foxglove, a plant that grew wild throughout Kentucky, and whose digitalis content could cause heart failure that was nearly impossible to distinguish from natural cardiac arrest. Morrison had died in his sleep, while Sarah and Catherine searched his room, taking his money, his watch, his horse, and everything else of value. The burial in the orchard was practical. No witnesses, no questions, no body that might later be exhumed and examined. The sisters discovered something that night that would define the next 9 years. Murder was profitable. Murder was relatively easy. And murder, when committed in the isolation of a frontier inn against travelers with no local connections, was nearly impossible to investigate. Over the following months, they refined their methodology. They selected victims carefully. Solo male travelers with money. Men who had no companions who might ask questions. Men who seemed to be traveling without specific schedules, or people expecting them at definite times. Men who were lonely, who responded to Sarah's attention, who could be isolated in their rooms and poisoned without witnesses. The method remained consistent. Sarah would spend the evening entertaining the chosen victim. She would serve him cider or wine that Catherine had prepared in the kitchen, drinks laced with foxglove tincture in carefully calculated doses. The victim would retire to his room, fall asleep, and die during the night from apparent heart failure. In the morning, Catherine would discover the body, express appropriate shock and sadness, call the doctor if one was available, or simply handle burial herself if not. The victim would be interred in the orchard. His possessions would be sold in Lexington or Louisville, far enough away that no one would connect them to Millbrook Inn. And the sisters would resume normal operations, waiting for the next profitable victim. They killed 6 men in 1838, 8 men in 1839, 7 men in 1840. The pace was steady, but not so frequent as to attract attention. Most months passed without murders. The inn hosted dozens of legitimate guests who stayed, paid, and left without incident. The occasional death was attributed to the hazards of frontier life. Doctors, when they examined bodies, found no evidence of violence. Heart failure, stroke, sudden illness. These were common enough explanations that no one questioned them seriously. The sisters were clever in other ways too. They varied their victim selection. Some months, they would choose wealthier travelers, men with significant money, who provided large payoffs, but whose disappearances might trigger more investigation. Other months, They would choose poorer men, laborers or farmers, traveling with modest savings. Men whose deaths would be noticed by no one. They never killed two travelers in rapid succession. They never killed anyone who had traveling companions. They never killed anyone who had mentioned expecting to meet people at specific times, in specific places. And they maintained their reputations as respectable Christian women. They attended church regularly in the nearby town of Nicholasville. They contributed to charitable causes. They were known as successful businesswomen who'd built a thriving establishment through hard work and proper management. No one suspected that the Cunningham sisters, who seemed so refined and virtuous, were systematically murdering their guests. But the sisters weren't just killing for money. The ledger revealed something darker, something that suggested their motivations went beyond simple robbery. Many entries included commentary that had nothing to do with financial gain. Sarah wrote about victims' personalities, about how they'd responded to her attention, about which ones had been amusing, or tedious, or surprisingly resistant to charm. She rated their deaths, describing some as satisfying and others as disappointing. Catherine's entries were more practical, but still revealed a woman who'd come to enjoy the power that murder provided. She wrote about refining the poison dosage, about experimenting with timing, about the satisfaction of discovering a dead body and performing grief for whatever local authorities might be called. She wrote about the thrill of selecting victims, of deciding who would live and who would die, based on calculations of profit and risk. The sisters had become serial killers, not just from financial motivation, but from psychological satisfaction. They enjoyed what they were doing. They'd found purpose and excitement in their murders that their legitimate business had never provided. By 1843, they'd killed 31 people. 31 travelers buried in the orchard behind Millbrook Inn. 31 murders that had generated approximately $8,000 in profits, making the Cunningham sisters quite wealthy by frontier standards. They'd expanded the inn, purchased additional land, and established themselves as prominent members of Jessamine County society. But in 1844, something changed in their operation. They began taking risks they'd previously avoided. They killed travelers who had mentioned specific destinations and expected arrival times. They killed men whose horses and possessions were distinctive enough that selling them might create connections. They killed with increasing frequency. 5 murders in the first 6 months of 1844 alone. Sarah's entries in the ledger from this period showed a woman growing bored with their previous careful approach. She wrote about wanting more interesting subjects, about being tired of farmers and merchants, about seeking victims who would provide better entertainment before death. She began spending more time with victims before poisoning them, extending the seduction over multiple days, building relationships that made the eventual murder more psychologically complex and, for her, more satisfying. Catherine tried to maintain caution, her entries showing concern about Sarah's increasingly reckless behavior. But she didn't stop her sister. She couldn't stop her, perhaps. Or didn't want to. The murders had become central to their existence, providing not just income, but purpose and excitement that neither sister wanted to abandon. The increased frequency and the risks they were taking made discovery inevitable. In September 1844, a man named Thomas Bennett stayed at Millbrook Inn. He was a relatively wealthy merchant with a distinctive gold pocket watch and a horse with unusual markings. Sarah spent 3 days entertaining him, longer than the sisters usually maintained contact with victims. On the 4th night, Bennett died in his room from apparent heart failure. 2 weeks later, Bennett's horse was recognized at a livestock market in Louisville. The seller claimed he'd purchased the horse from a private party, but the description matched someone from the Millbrook Inn area. Bennett's family, who'd been expecting him in Nashville and had become concerned when he didn't arrive, hired a private investigator to trace his route. The investigator determined that Bennett had stayed at Millbrook Inn and had died there. He visited the inn and questioned the sisters, who explained that Bennett had died suddenly, that the doctor had pronounced it heart failure, that they'd buried him in their orchard, as was their custom for guests who died on the property. Everything seemed legitimate, except for one detail. Bennett's family knew he'd been carrying the gold watch, a treasured heirloom. The sisters claimed he'd had no such watch, that his possessions had been minimal. The investigator's report raised questions, but not enough for immediate action. Bennett's death could have been natural. The watch could have been stolen before he reached Millbrook Inn. There was no clear evidence of crime. But the report reached the desk of a Kentucky state marshal named Robert Whitmore, who had a particular interest in frontier crimes. Whitmore was methodical, patient, and skeptical of coincidences. He began investigating other deaths at Millbrook Inn, requesting records from local doctors, talking to people who'd known travelers who'd never arrived at their destinations. Over the following 2 years, Whitmore compiled a list of 16 travelers who had either died at Millbrook Inn or had last been seen heading toward it before disappearing. 16 deaths or disappearances over 8 years. The number was high, but not impossibly so for a frontier establishment. People died from disease constantly. Travelers disappeared for many reasons. But Whitmore noticed patterns. All the victims were men. All were traveling alone. All had been carrying money or valuables, according to people who'd seen them before their deaths or disappearances. And all had stayed at an inn operated by 2 unmarried women, which, while not criminal, was unusual enough to merit attention. Whitmore couldn't get a warrant based on suspicions alone. He needed evidence. He decided to visit Millbrook Inn himself, posing as a traveler, to observe the sisters' operations firsthand. Whitmore arrived at Millbrook Inn in October 1847. He presented himself as a merchant, traveling from Lexington to Nashville with money from recent sales. He was exactly the type of victim the sisters preferred. Solo traveler, carrying cash, no specific schedule, no one expecting him at a definite time. Sarah paid attention to him that first evening. She sat with him in the common room, asked about his travels, laughed at his stories, touched his arm in ways that suggested interest. Whitmore, experienced in reading people, recognized immediately that her attention was performance. that she was evaluating him for purposes beyond simple hospitality. Catherine brought him cider before bed. Whitmore, suspicious of everything, found an excuse to avoid drinking most of it. He poured half the cup into a plant in his room when the sisters weren't watching. That night, he slept lightly, with his pistol within reach, uncertain what might happen but prepared for trouble. Nothing happened that first night. Whitmore woke naturally in the morning, went down for breakfast, and announced he would stay another night, as he was enjoying the hospitality and in no particular hurry to reach Nashville. The sisters seemed pleased. Sarah spent even more time with him that second day. They walked together in the orchard, Sarah pointing out the apple trees she and her sister had planted, talking about their success in building the inn, making Whitmore feel special and desired. That evening, Catherine again brought him cider before bed. This time Whitmore watched her prepare it. He saw her add something to the cup from a small bottle she kept in the kitchen. He saw her stir it carefully, then bring it to him with a smile. He accepted it, pretended to drink, and again disposed of most of it in the plant in his room. That night, Whitmore didn't sleep. He sat in his room with his pistol ready, waiting to see what would happen. Around 2 a.m, he heard careful footsteps outside his door. The handle turned slowly, quietly. The door opened a crack. In the dim moonlight from his window, Whitmore saw Catherine peer into the room, checking to see if he was dead. Whitmore remained perfectly still, breathing slowly, pretending to be in deep sleep or deceased. Catherine opened the door wider and entered, moving toward his bed to check his pulse. Sarah followed her, carrying a small lamp. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, Marshal Whitmore's investigation reaches its critical moment. If this story is affecting you, share this video with someone who needs to understand how evil can disguise itself as hospitality. Hit that like button to support our content, and subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together how these sisters of death were finally exposed. Because what happened in that room would break their 9-year murder spree. Whitmore sat up suddenly, pistol aimed at the sisters. "Don't move," he said quietly. "I'm a Kentucky State Marshal, and you're both under arrest for attempted murder." The sisters froze. Sarah dropped the lamp, which fortunately didn't break. Catherine's face cycled through shock, fear, and finally a kind of resigned calculation. "We've done nothing wrong," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "We came to check on our guest. We heard noises and were concerned." At 2 a.m, with materials for searching a dead man's possessions. Whitmore gestured at the small bag Sarah had been carrying, which had fallen when she dropped the lamp. Neither sister responded. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 9 years of murder finally collapsing. "I'm going to search this inn," Whitmore continued, "and I suspect I'm going to find evidence of what you've been doing to travelers. You can cooperate, or I can bring more marshals and tear this building apart. Your choice." Catherine made her choice quickly. She'd built Millbrook Inn through calculation, through careful management of risks and rewards. She understood when a situation was unrecoverable. Fighting would only make things worse. "The ledger is under the kitchen floorboards," she said quietly. "Third board from the stove. Everything is documented there." Sarah made a sound of protest, but Catherine silenced her with a look. "It's over, Sarah. We knew it would end eventually. At least this way we maintain some dignity." Whitmore found the ledger where Catherine indicated. Reading it by lamplight in the kitchen, he felt his stomach turn. 9 years. 43 victims. Detailed descriptions of murders that had been committed with the same care and attention that other people brought to legitimate business operations. He arrested both sisters on the spot. By dawn, he'd sent for additional marshals and a doctor who could examine the bodies that would need to be exhumed from the orchard. By midday, the excavation had begun, revealing grave after shallow grave, each containing remains that confirmed what the ledger described. The investigation that followed lasted 4 months. Authorities identified 27 of the 43 victims through personal effects, found buried with the bodies or sold in nearby cities. The other 16 remained unnamed, travelers who'd been so thoroughly erased that even their identities were lost. The identified victims revealed the breadth of the sisters' crimes. Merchants, farmers, laborers, even 2 doctors traveling to establish practices in Western settlements. All men, all traveling alone. All killed for combinations of money and what the sisters had called entertainment. The poison that Catherine had been using was confirmed as foxglove tincture. The plant grew wild throughout the property. Catherine had been harvesting and preparing it for years, refining her dosage through what her journal called practical experimentation on her victims. The doctor examining the remains found digitalis in tissue samples from several recent victims, confirming the poisoning method. The trial began in March 1848 in Jessamine County Circuit Court. It was the most sensational criminal case in Kentucky history up to that point. Newspapers across the country covered the proceedings. The idea of 2 women, particularly sisters, committing serial murder shocked Victorian sensibilities that assumed women were naturally gentle and incapable of sustained violence. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They had the bodies of 43 victims. They had the ledger documenting each murder in the sisters' own handwriting. They had Marshal Whitmore's testimony about catching them in the act of checking what they'd expected to be his corpse. They had testimony from the elderly cook, Martha, who admitted she'd suspected something wrong for years, but had been too frightened to report it. The defense attempted several strategies. They argued the ledger was fictional, a bizarre creative writing project rather than documentation of real crimes. This argument collapsed when specific details in the ledger matched specific bodies and possessions. They argued that if murders had occurred, Sarah was the dominant personality who'd forced Catherine to participate. This argument was undermined by Catherine's detailed technical entries about poison preparation and dosage refinement. They finally argued temporary insanity, claiming the isolation of frontier life and the unnatural position of women operating a business without male guidance had driven the sisters mad. The jury didn't believe any of it. The sisters had operated too methodically, too successfully, for too long. They'd kept excellent records. They'd hidden evidence carefully. They'd managed complex logistics. They'd maintained completely normal appearances in public, while murdering travelers in private. This wasn't madness. This was calculated, sustained evil. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The jury deliberated for 12 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 43 counts of first-degree murder for both sisters. The evidence admitted no other conclusion. Judge Thomas Harrison delivered the sentence with visible disgust. He called the sisters aberrations of nature, who had violated every principle of Christian womanhood and human decency. He sentenced both Catherine and Sarah Cunningham to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for July 26, 1848. The 4 months between sentencing and execution revealed the sisters' final relationship. They were housed in separate cells, but allowed supervised visits twice weekly. Unlike many condemned criminals who spent final months in prayer and seeking redemption, the Cunningham sisters spent their time discussing their crimes with a detachment that disturbed their jailers. Catherine wrote a memoir defending their actions. She argued they'd been providing a service by eliminating men who'd accumulated wealth through exploitation of others. She claimed their victims had deserved death for various sins she invented or assumed. She portrayed herself and Sarah as instruments of justice rather than murderers. Her manuscript was over 80 pages of moral reasoning, so twisted it became nearly incomprehensible. It was sealed by the court and remains restricted from public access. Sarah wrote poetry. Dozens of poems about death, about power, about the pleasure of holding someone's life in your hands and choosing to take it. The poems were technically accomplished, showing genuine literary talent, but their content was so disturbing that the prison chaplain refused to read them. Sarah's poetry was also sealed and has never been published. Both sisters refused to express remorse. In their final visits together, they discussed their murders with what witnesses described as nostalgia, reminiscing about particular victims the way other people might reminisce about successful business transactions or pleasant social occasions. The only moment when either sister showed emotion approaching regret came 2 days before execution. Sarah, in her cell, spoke to the prison chaplain, who'd been trying unsuccessfully to minister to her for months. "I'm not sorry for what we did," she said quietly. "I'm sorry we were caught. I'm sorry we got careless. We could have continued for years if Catherine hadn't let me push the pace. We could have killed 100 men, 200, and no one would have stopped us. That's what I regret. Not the murders. The waste of potential." The chaplain, horrified, asked if she understood she would soon face God's judgment. "If God exists," Sarah replied, "and if he judges us, I suspect he'll be more interested in the men we killed than in us. They weren't innocent. No one is. We just made their guilt matter." The execution took place as scheduled on July 26, 1848, in the courtyard of Jessamine County Jail. Over 4,000 people attended, the largest execution crowd in Kentucky history up to that point. Women were discouraged from attending, the authorities considering the sight of women being hanged too disturbing for female sensibilities. But many came anyway, disguised in men's clothing, or simply ignoring the prohibition. The Cunningham sisters were brought to the gallows together. They wore matching black dresses, both having refused religious vestments. They stood side by side on the platform, holding hands, presenting a united front, even in death. They were asked if they had final words. Catherine spoke first. "We lived as we chose," she said, her voice steady. "We built a successful business. We provided hospitality to dozens of satisfied guests. Some guests were less fortunate, but such is the nature of business. Some transactions are more profitable than others." Sarah spoke next, her voice quieter, but still audible to the front rows of the crowd. "I have no regrets except that we're ending here. I wish we'd been more careful. I wish we'd continued longer. I wish I'd had more time to perfect what we were doing. That's all." The hoods were placed. The nooses were adjusted. Catherine and Sarah Cunningham died together as they'd lived together, holding hands, bound by crimes that had made them wealthy, powerful, and ultimately infamous. Millbrook Inn was demolished within weeks of the execution. The property was purchased by a group of local investors who razed every building on the site. The orchard where 43 victims had been buried was cut down completely. Every apple tree was removed. The ground was plowed and left fallow. Local clergy blessed the property repeatedly, performing rituals meant to cleanse what had happened there. The 43 bodies were reburied in a mass grave in Nicholasville Cemetery. A single stone was erected, bearing only the inscription, "43 souls lost to evil. May they rest in peace and be remembered." Most of the victims' families were too poor to afford individual markers. The collective grave became a place where people would gather occasionally to mourn travelers who'd been killed far from home. The ledger and other documents were sealed by court order and weren't released to researchers until 1948, 100 years after the executions. Reading the ledger remains a disturbing experience. The clinical tone, the ratings and commentary, the complete absence of empathy for victims who were described as objects, as opportunities, as sources of income and entertainment, rather than human beings. Modern criminologists have studied the Cunningham sisters extensively. They represent one of the earliest documented cases of female serial killers operating as a team, where two women worked together systematically to murder for combined financial and psychological motivations. They also represent an early example of what's now called Black Widow killing, where women use hospitality and seduction to access victims. The psychological question that haunts researchers is how two sisters became murderers together. The answer seems to involve their isolation and interdependence. Operating a frontier inn required both sisters' contributions. Catherine's business sense and Sarah's charm were both necessary for success. When they discovered murder as a revenue source, both participated because both benefited. Their crimes became normalized through mutual participation, each sister's involvement validating the other's choices. The Cunningham case influenced American law in several ways. Kentucky passed stricter regulations for frontier inns, requiring regular inspections and documentation of all guest deaths. Innkeepers who reported multiple guest deaths faced mandatory investigations. And serial murder committed by women received attention it hadn't previously, as society began to recognize that women were capable of sustained violence, despite cultural assumptions to the contrary. But perhaps the most important legacy is the reminder that evil doesn't announce itself obviously. The Cunningham sisters were respectable businesswomen. They provided good service to most guests. They appeared refined and virtuous. They attended church and contributed to charity. And, behind that facade of respectability, they murdered 43 people over 9 years without anyone suspecting, until they grew careless. Jessamine County today has no marker indicating where Millbrook Inn stood. The location is now farmland owned by descendants of people who knew nothing about what happened there. Most local residents are only vaguely aware of the Cunningham sisters, if they know about them at all. The history has been deliberately forgotten, buried as completely as the victims who died in that orchard. But some memories persist. The Kentucky Historical Society maintains records of the case. Descendants of identified victims occasionally visit the mass grave in Nicholasville. And researchers continue studying the ledger, trying to understand how 2 women who should have been bound by sisterly affection instead became bound by murder, operating a killing ground disguised as hospitality for nearly a decade. What do you think about the Cunningham sisters? How could 2 women commit 43 murders without arousing serious suspicion for so long? Could frontier isolation explain their crimes? Or was there something darker in their natures that would have emerged regardless of circumstance? Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates dark history told honestly. The stories we're most tempted to forget are often the ones most important to remember. At Liturgy of Fear, we believe in facing history's darkest chapters without flinching, because understanding how evil operates is the first step toward preventing it from happening again. See you in the next video.